Yeah, this is going to be yet another video, I guess, on deconstructing the moves that are being played in the social justice movement racket. I really even hate talking about, it's just such a disgusting topic to even touch, to even have exposure to. It's really quite sickening. And it's designed to be that way by the people who advocate for it. In fact, that's how they measure progress, by how much upset they can cause and how much disruption and destabilization of liberal values. This is how they measure their effectiveness. And so generally it's like a kind of it's a blatantly racist gambit. And then if you have a problem with what they do, then they label you as racist and fascistic. And the reason why often they can, so sort of, it's kind of strange, because there is a kind of a deep-seated cognitive dissonance, because everyone who is in the movement kind of intuitively, emotionally knows how the emotional argument works, and they know why they have to attack in order to defend their position. They know why they have to slander their opponents in often quite personal ways, in often quite demeaning ways, and calling them directly racist, because they don't support this indirect model of how justice is going to come about. So because there's a kind of a primal hypocrisy right at the core of the racist heart of the social justice movement, they have to project that racism onto other people. And then they have the convenient excuse that history is reducible to identity, and so then they can just use that to force everyone to represent those ideological tokens of history. So everyone gets history projected onto them, and that is the only way to fix the history, to revise the history, which is their definition of justice, while completely ignoring everything in the present. And this is their formula even for accessing their individuality that has at its core a kind of reflection of the historical they talk about feelings in their body. This is the spirit of fascism, where you have to kind of vindicate your identity, which is connected to history, by treating everyone as an ideological token and having them absorb your vindictive racism as a kind of revenge that brings balance to the history. So you have to create things that are offensive in the present, things that are racist in the present, to counterbalance the racism of the past. And so, it's quite a simplistic, oversimplified reduction of life into this kind of revenge emotional argument. And this is exactly the program of any fascistic movement. The only way that it kind of escapes from understanding itself to be fascistic, because at its spiritual core it really is fascism, but the only way that it can manage to overlook this is because they say what they want is a quality of outcome which has the word equality in it. And so then they can say, we can't be racist because we want everyone to be the same, and this is how we bring balance by revenge. So the principle of equality of outcome is an absolute necessity for saving themselves from the racist label. So they can perpetrate their racism, which gets completely covered over, because all they want is equality of outcome in this lifetime or in this present or whatever. And whenever you sort of directly compensate people in this way to sort of allow them to get away with their racism in the present, it should come as no surprise that that doesn't actually make things better. In fact, it kind of reinforces the racialist identity which is at the core of the ideology. And when it does this, it can't actually build true capacity. It can't sustainably develop access to any kind of authentic self-esteem. So all you have is this kind of ideological counter-privilege and this ideological counter-racialist pride, So all of these sorts of projections of racism is the exact excuse for the social justice movement to employ and deploy, disgusting racialist lines of solutions, which end up undermining any kind of authentic parity, So when you've got people propped up on the back of these direct compensations for history, they have to kind of double down to really believe that this is the solution, because when it ends up benefiting people for essentially buying into this ideological circus show of racialist, identity as the only way to access justice, it forces people to kind of factionalize into separatist containers, because they can't influence each other in any non-racialist humanist way. They can only influence each other as an identity impinging upon another identity. And so, it becomes this kind of transaction of justice where the communication has to be filtered by this kind of sympathy revenge paradigm, so it's very pathological. In much the same way that borderline personality disorder types relate to their environment and into their surroundings, and how they have to project this narrative that never allows them to be accountable for being in the situation, because they're always in the situation because somebody else controlled the history. And, it never gets to the point where they actually control their responsibility for their own beingness in the present. Everything is the effect of history. And so there's no creative dimension. There's no transformative synthesis that there's any kind of responsibility for engaging in. The only vehicle for salvation is this identity, which also means that, because the only way that you can extract justice with an identity is if you live in a kind of tyrannical system which has very fixed, rigid, centralized power systems. Because the only way that you can get your identity pandered to or kind of compensated is if you have some kind of centralized force which has the regulatory power to kind of redistribute something. So you end up having to create a polity in which there's a tremendous kind of authoritarian surge of a kind of moral paternalism that becomes this kind of pervasive, so it changes the whole political scenario into a kind of demagogue's wet dream. It becomes the kind of society that is capable of delivering what the social justice movement is demanding from it, which is a kind of authoritarian representative of the system at large. And so you have to create a society in which there are only big players. And already, for example, the kind of toxic regulation in South Africa, which has basically made small businesses practically or virtually extinct. It's incredibly hard to have a successful small business. It's incredibly hard to grow the economy from the bottom up, because you have sort of like fascists like Julius Malema saying, well, every company must surrender 51% of its equity to its workers. I mean, this is the vision, that every company is some kind of public company, that it's this big, massive, a kind of bureaucratic, I mean, how do you do 51% if you've got a small business with 4 people in it? I mean, it's just kind of, it doesn't work. It doesn't scale. It only works when you can kind of project this narrative of that everything is this system, which and identity is the only way that you can negotiate in that system. And so identity becomes this kind of symbolic brand that all reality is kind of oversimplified and reduced into conforming with, as if identity is the thing that makes the difference, or that makes the grade, or that does anything, or does any of the work. Is just identity. And so it overlooks all the aspects of practical reality and even simplistic economic understanding that just gets completely disregarded. Not to mention that you get a very fake and oversimplified mythologizing of history to fit with this narrative. I mean, the expropriation without compensation in land controversy in South Africa. I mean, it's all based on fake statistics. It's based on statistics that were kind of taken from 1991, which was even before the New South Africa. It's even those statistics that were taken from 1991 were not even reported accurately. They were kind of already twisted. So it's like the whole thing is just propaganda. I mean, it's propaganda that's brilliant for a tyrant to kind of look like he's offering some kind of moral paternalism to a system in need of justice for the identity. And so, you get a lot of really deceptive propaganda, which is wonderful for kind of having this broad-based support from the bottom of a corrupt, mismanaging, ineffective tyrant that's effectively going to be very good at doing what people of his sort have always done and have been doing in South Africa. It's just turning up the pressure on the identity scapegoat to alleviate and to detract from and divert from the actual function of politics, which is to solve problems. So, I mean, the problem of poverty in South Africa has got nothing to do with racism. It is a legitimate problem that needs to be tackled. But to call it racism and to is to really lose track of any of the means you have of actually solving the problem. And to create this kind of identity zero-sum game, that the only way that poverty is going to be alleviated is because it's black, and black needs to find some way to take revenge on the white identity. I mean, it's ludicrous. I mean, it really is, it's garbage. It works very well in a very simplistic, formulaic, oversimplified reduction. And to make the world fit that narrative, you really have to distort things on such a level in which responsibility from the ground up will be made impossible, because people will only be allowed to succeed because of their identity and not because of anything else. In fact, they will be discouraged from accumulating any kind of capacity which is defined as privileged. So they're kind of, they will be policed as never being allowed to have their minds, their minds must always be monitored to make sure that they're decolonized, and that becomes the second wave of a kind of ideological way for the tyrants to keep power. It turns, because I mean, this ideology only seems to work when they haven't taken power, when they're the underdogs, because when you have no power, you have no way to measure any kind of, how well are you actually doing? How much progress have you actually made? So as soon as they get power, they have to completely control the narrative in terms of, why isn't progress being achieved? It's because of this greater racial conspiracy against us. It gets more and more paranoid. And it eventually has to kind of, it continuously has to find some kind of human sacrifice to justify its failings. And so this is why it has to double down. In fact, I would say that this movement is already a doubling down of feminism, is already a doubling down. So you had to invent this kind of this greater explanation, and description of why things aren't great, and why you need more radical violence, because as soon as you can only measure progress in this ideology by the destabilization of liberal values, and when you do that, you end up usually creating an incredibly corrupt system of mismanagement, and then the only excuse you have is that, well, you haven't been radical enough, you haven't actually delivered the revenge, you haven't destroyed the identity that holds the privilege. And so in your campaign against, erasing the privilege, you end up creating a more debilitated scenario. You end up saying that people aren't allowed to negotiate culture on the level of the individual. They're not allowed to be what they want to be, because what they want to be is, privilege is antithetical to that. So you've got this kind of really semantic bullshit, festering list of everything that people aren't allowed to do, which is like to be in the image of privilege. And that, because privilege is the only way to link the past with the present. And so this is really the whole linchpin of the ideology, which is effectively bullshit, because privilege is the only way to impose blame for history on the problems of the present, on people that need to be destroyed and have racism put onto them, because that is how you measure progress, is how much racism has been absorbed by the people of privilege. I mean, this is, it has the same ideological function as the Jewish conspiracy in the Nazi philosophy. It's exactly the same kind of construct. And as I've said before, the only thing that saves the social justice movement from seeing itself as racist is because they are pushing for equality of outcome, which will happen when privilege is destroyed. So that allows them to create that false project that when that is accomplished, then everyone will be great. Everyone will have their situation fixed. When the truth is, no, you will actually have, everything will be taken away from the successful people, but that doesn't mean that that success will be redistributed in the system even. In fact, it'll probably be, it'll take on a new form. It'll have to find some way in order, the tyrant will have to, the authoritarian system will have to find some way, to either sustain it or have it just dissipated. I mean, a lot of the looting that took place in Nazi Germany, in terms of the kind of a lot of the economy was propped up by the Nazi gold and all those things, but. It's just like in the land situation. I mean, 9% of the land in the country is privately owned. The rest is pretty much, it is largely owned by the government, and there's a lot of fertile land. But people don't want the fertile land. They want land that has already been developed into farms that are already functional. So there's a lot of arable land out there, but people don't want that. They just want the economically valuable land which has already been worked by people for, that's been in the economy and that's been productive. And so when you redistribute resources on the basis of some kind of ideological direct compensation, it's completely antithetical to actually safeguarding the maximum amount of people in the system, who depend on a functional industry like food production. Not to mention the fact that if you actually look at the actual statistics, I mean, there are many provinces in which there's a majority of black-owned farmland. I mean, the 80-20 statistics especially when it comes to farming, it's a complete deception. I mean, it's literally is propaganda. I mean, pretty much the Western Cape is probably the only province in which there's a, there's a massive more non-black farmers than other farmers, but I mean that's kind of historical because the Western Cape has a different demographic. It's kind of, that makes sense. If you look at the rest of the country, I mean, the amount of black-owned farmland is, as I've said, it's even a majority in 2 provinces, and it's more than a significant portion in all the others. So it's very strange that they use 1991 statistics. They're just there's so much manipulation whenever you have this kind of fascistic identitarian project, which has to kind of be fed a very simplistic narrative in order to sustain itself. And the reason why it has to be so aggressive and why it has to attack its opponents so much is because it's built on hypocrisy at the core of it. And so the only way to take when it's challenged directly, or when it's asked about directly, you can see this in the Dyson. When Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson were debating against Dyson, and there was also, I don't remember, the woman the female participant who was a writer or some kind of journalist and activist. But Dyson is a professor, and I mean it's just you see the perfect exemplar of this fascistic. I think I actually want to read out. I had I wrote some comments on this debate. I think I'm just going to read them. Dyson's tactics revolve around creating an autistic revisionism that if people aren't willing to have the racism of history projected onto them, which can serve to indirectly elevate the black person who is merely standing up to be counted as the only authentic individual, will be deprived of his individualism because of other people's unwillingness to absorb the label of racist, controlled and dispensed by Dyson's narrative orthodoxy. Dyson gets to humiliate people with his own blatant racist and prejudiced attitude while calling everyone who doesn't agree with him a racist for not conforming to the vindictive project of balancing the historical record, with retributivism that he gets to dispense and radically invoke, while this somehow allows him to access his individuality more deeply by forcing other people to share in the damage his identity feels. All the while denigrating respect for people as individuals and demanding everyone become representatives for Dyson's historical progress, as everyone is transformed into dehumanized ideological tokens, which is felt inside Dyson's body as the internalized reflection of history that renders his identity, and then needs to be implanted into everybody as his identity, so his identity can get the validation it deserves. This is the spirit of fascism, which gets conflated into a semantic core of Dyson's individuality. Dyson was correct that his individuality is getting repressed and fought back against by conservatives and the enlightened liberals who don't recognize the left that he represents. It's because he is a racist, peddling a fascist program of destructive integration, in the name of revenge reasoning devoted to the hysterical emotional logic of table-thumping historical accusations to preserve the sophistry of an oversimplified formula of orthodox control that engineers fake and racist solutions. And then, in brackets, I said, the sad truth is that around 20% of the population find the SJW mentality compatible with their personality style. And when this 20% is mobilized under a political vehicle, it can easily reframe the culture with its retributive paranoia, dysfunctional destabilization of liberal values, self-aggravating feedback loop. So that is the feedback loop. This cultural trend has been successfully repressed in most of the West's history. We must quickly find a means to debunking these pseudo-intellectuals before society devolves into a measuring contest of superficial moral paternalism that suffocates access to mediating notions of self-criticism and individual accountability within society. I tried to tell Dan Harmon about this. And the reason why Dyson's position requires him to take to such an offensive line in order to defend its virtue is because the position is fundamentally hypocritical and unsound. And the more that the culture he represents gets politically pandered to, it will create the kind of corruption at the heart of the South African state and political establishment. I really think that you have to take a long look at South Africa and a detailed look at South Africa and to really defeat this ideology at its core. How the betrayal of non-racialism and how that precipitates corruption as a kind of that becomes a kind of feedback loop. I made another comment, so I'm just going to read a part of it because maybe it has another interesting way of deconstructing the ideology. The hypocrisy of demanding to be treated as an individual, while professing that this will only happen after everyone has internalized and been implanted with an ideological filter which oversimplifies life into the formula of history equals identity equals cause and effect, which has a fixed and generic solution. Additional counter-racism equals justified vindictiveness, equals the achievement of equality of outcome, or until the achievement of equality of outcome. This is a political recipe for borderline personality disorder and fascistic personalities that tap into their sadistically edged behavior of destructive integration and label this vindictiveness as necessary for the greater good, while pretending that internalized disempowerments of other groups provides the only legitimate platform of their individualism, when it is just the brand of racism, perhaps that counts as individualism when you conceal the glaring racism by advocating for equality of outcome. That's a bit laborious at the end there, but so I guess that's just my ideological. I was going to add that when you see people who are hypocritically racist like this, it can often inflame people to kind of just okay, well then we need to actually I'll go with them halfway because it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to fix their hypocrisy because their hypocrisy belongs to them. But then I'll just follow half of what they say. I'll get into the separate but equal development then. If that's how they want to be, then we need to separate each other so that we, so that we're not prone to have that kind of racism shed onto us or something like that. But already to kind of, that sort of solution already gives up the whole political sphere into a kind of authoritarian, if you want to counter this systematically, if you want to counter this ideology systematically, it forces you to essentially play its game, which I would say, well, then you've still lost. You've just lost to the tyrant on your side of the fence, not to the tyrant on the other side of the fence, not to the factional demagogue, and so this is the essential problem with dealing with this whole thing, is that it's incredibly toxic. It's very hard to touch without it getting it on you, unless you're very keen at understanding exactly how it operates and exactly how it destabilizes liberal values. And so it represents the end of liberal values. It represents the end of an open state that's capable of actually having a healthy political democracy, because already if you're going to get into any kind of identity politics, that means that the role of politics is to deliver justice to identity, and then you're always comparing, and fractionating, and coming up with some kind of demagogue's compromise when you're no longer dealing with the solutions to political problems on the issues as a kind of practical way of doing it the best, which actually gives you access to touching reality and touching what's happening on the ground, and actually, different political issues need to be dealt with differently. But the main thing is that if you want to sustainably fix anything, you need to do it with access, with creating a kind of access that individuals can end up owning themselves, rather than it's going to be continually dispensed to them by the centralized state. And so, generally the power of the state is to help coordination of the private sector and to promote the private sector to bridge and be the foundation upon which people empower themselves, which has just not been allowed to done. It's actually been taken off the table in South Africa because the government has to be the good guy. So the government has had to demand things from the private sector, which only big companies can even have a hope of dispensing. So there's a kind of a very toxic regulation which has practically destroyed the third leg of the economy, which is small businesses, which are the traditional skills incubator. To not have small business in a country with this level of unemployment, is just a disaster waiting to happen. And now the government is going to excuse itself by blaming the white identity, while it continues to mismanage resources and create an ideologically intoxifying situation that makes eventually fascism the only solution, which Julius Malema is on the political scene doing his damnedest to peddle fake statistics and to control the narrative in a way, as only fascists can, threatening anyone who doesn't, who threatens to expose the kind of the very, and most of the political establishment is so kind of out of touch and corrupt in some kind of mediocre way that they can't help but they don't have the philosophical sophistication to penetrate this bullshit, and so they end up feeding into it. They end up, I can also be a moral paternalist. I can also infantilize the masses and offer the justice to their identities. It becomes a kind of cultural orthodoxy. There's always the culture always becomes fascism before the politics. It's very unsettling to see the new South Africa essentially hollowed out by such cheap political tactics. And this is directly because of people like Dyson. This very toxic political atmosphere from the West that has created the environment for this kind of ridiculous and ludicrous fake salvation of justice for the identity to undermine what was a very healthy political framework, which had problems which were not allowed to be addressed because of this racialist orthodoxy, because of this identity shit that the corrupt people in power could use to shield themselves from criticism and deflect it. So just shows you how destructive this ideology really is, and this,